and I too, like my colleague Deputy Kit, welcome the opportunity from Deputy Ellis and his party, the opportunity to discuss this issue, to discuss and debate the contents of the bill that's put before the House, to acknowledge their right to do so, to compliment them for their efforts. But I wouldn't call it flawed. And I think, they and ourselves and many others were making suggestions over the past number of years, and if it had been taken on board, we mightn't be at the juncture we are presently. And if it's adjudged to be opportunistic, as I think you mentioned, it's an opportunity that was handed to them in the form of a penalty kick, insofar as it was plain for them to do so. I think it's important, rather than attacking the opposition or attacking the suggestions or proposals or policies that they've put forward over the last number of years, that you adequately attack the problem and allow us look back in any given year at improvements that might have been made in the year. And it's particularly poignant on this day that this bill is before the House and we discuss it on the first anniversary of the death of Jonathan Corry, and we again collectively send our condolences to his family and acknowledge the hurt and the difficulty and trauma that's experienced by many people on a regular basis and their families whom are affected by the terrible dilemma that is homelessness, that is the threat of homelessness, that is the worry and the fear of oneself or one's family being left without a home, and the greater trauma and frustration that in the event of that eventuality becoming a reality, that the state not being in a position to help and assist what some have described, and rightly so, as a human right. I, along with many others, had hoped that that terrible incident would have been a watershed moment, would have been the catalyst to act where government unfortunately had failed to act in the previous 4 years, albeit under the tutorship of other ministers within government, namely Hogan and O'Sullivan. However, having entered into and played our small role in that negotiation process that you initiated, which we commended you for with the best of intent, and knew that and expected that it was in the best of good faith, as no doubt it was. But a year on, the commitments that emanated from that about ending homelessness or going a long way towards it, unfortunately haven't been realised. And that's not just me speaking, that's not just various members of the opposition speaking, that's coming from those at the coalface. Others have referred to the commentary by stakeholders today on this anniversary, whether it be Father McVerry's Trust, Focus Ireland, Simon, Vincent de Paul, even local authorities officials will tell you. This problem, unfortunately, has not gone away. This problem, unfortunately, has deteriorated further. This problem, unfortunately, it was that initially. It became a crisis. It has become an emergency, and is something that you just don't seem to be able to unravel, and that's most unfortunate. And I think the resolutions that you eventually brought forward in recent weeks was little and was very late. And during the vacuum, even in that period, and that alone the vacuum that was created by inaction for the previous 2 or 3 years, has allowed, as other speakers have alluded to, the rental sector to grow enormously in the form of the rent that's been sought and paid by many. The immediacy of the problem still exists. And as I said, that's notwithstanding your efforts, and some have been commendable, as late and as little as they were, in relation to rent certainty, in relation to rent controls, in relation to deposit retention scheme. Those are welcome developments. They should have happened long before this. But somebody who couldn't afford the rent or was finding it very difficult or very hard to pay the rent 6 or 8 weeks ago before your announcements still find it very difficult to pay the rent, and many can't. And what was announced and the details within it, and we've been discussing much of the contents in the rent certainties legislation that you brought forward earlier today, do not, unfortunately, address people in that dilemma. And the Taoiseach refuted the suggestion again today, as he and you and others have continuously done over the last 18 months to 2 years, that you will not entertain the possibility of increases in rent supplement. And we accept and acknowledge that the supply situation will take time to unravel, despite the late start that has been made. And I reiterate, it has been a late start, and it was too easy to say that the funds weren't available. It's too easy to say that you wouldn't help or assist the construction sector during that time because you owed them something because of the association it had with a previous government, or that's at least the picture you wanted to paint, and that was gaining, that held water with the public, and that was an excuse of inaction on your part, and that and many other issues pertaining to the previous election and the campaign involved in your election could be rerun in the next election. But people won't buy that anymore. And people are not interested in that anymore. And people, as I oft-times said, gave you, your party and your government colleagues a huge majority. And it asked you to take your role seriously. It asked you and all members of government whom were given the responsibility and the privilege to enact legislation, to address difficulties, to propose initiatives, to put policy in place, to allow it to be debated with your colleagues here and with the opposition, to allow legislation to be scrutinised, to allow amendments to be sought and accepted, and ultimately better legislation put in place to address these issues. But you let yourself down in many areas in that regard, and I can point to the highest level of guillotining by any government that went before it, because that was the sort of arrogance, unfortunately, that took hold. And it's been reiterated and repeated on several occasions, against the backdrop of supposedly a 6% growth in the economy, against the backdrop of us having gone into recovery over 12 months ago, against the backdrop of an extra £1.5 billion being pulled out of the hat in the recent election. And you believe that that election and that budget is one which will suffice and allow you and your government party colleagues re-election, because you've addressed the USC, because you've addressed taxation issues and you've put more money in people's pockets, or so you believe. The increase in car insurance alone, let alone health insurance, will put paid to that. So let's forget that scenario. You have failed to listen to the suggestion, and the greatest suggestion that has come to address this issue in the short term and the immediacy of the problem in order to stabilise the situation for your building programme to eventually take hold, is that of rent allowance. It is that of subvention. And that will be your greatest downfall. And the Taoiseach only again today refused to entertain that suggestion. And I know, for example, and I said earlier today, there's no doubt that there will be many departments across government who will come in under budget in the coming weeks. But that's the election war chest that will be used to fight fires as they arise, if they arise, around the country in various constituencies. But it should be incumbent on you today to recognise the fact, on this day of all days and the anniversary that occurs on it, that in an area where you have abjectly failed and failed miserably, that you want to correct that wrong. And funding should be sought and collected from those sources and put against and set aside to address this rent issue immediately in the form of rent supplement. And that, at this late stage, at this 11th hour, would be welcomed by all sides of the House as a reasonable, understood, means and method by which this issue could be stabilised and people could be stopped from going homeless, because that's what you're facing, let alone the eventual correction you made to the insolvency legislation, whereby the bank veto gave them the power to ensure that families were put at risk, against the backdrop of housing not being available. And finally, I will say, and I can't understand for the life of me how you're allowing the sale by NAMA of Project Arrow, 7 billion reputedly, being sold for 1 billion, with 50% of it being residential units, and they being available for people on housing lists if you got them at 100,000 a pop. And that's on the basis of you having been informed, I understand, by NAMA in recent months that there's a 2 billion surplus or dividend available to the state, to the government, because of their work once it's complete. So they're just some final suggestions at the 11th hour in the hope that you might take them on board, despite the fact that you've failed to listen to them and acknowledge them in the past. And I again, add my voice and my support to the bill. There may be elements of this bill that's in front of us that could be changed, could be amended, but that's what I would have expected a caring and an understanding government to do, because that's something that I can live with. As I said at the start, they no more than us or any member of opposition is more than entitled to play their part by virtue of the representation and the opportunity they've been given by the electorate to represent them in the fashion that they see fit. And if they see fit in putting forward legislation or a bill or a motion that seeks to address the inaction of government over 5 years that brings us to this scenario here today, they are more than entitled to do so, and they deserve my support at least, if nobody else.
Thank you, Deputy.